There is a kind of faith that does not announce itself. It does not stand on rooftops and declare its presence to the crowds. It does not demand signs or wait for the dramatic fulfillment of a promised blessing before it begins to act. It does not require certainty, guarantee, or visible evidence that what it is doing will ever matter. It simply moves quietly in the direction of what is good, what is generous, and what honors something larger than itself. And in that quietness, without any awareness that history is watching, it sets in motion forces that will reshape everything. Ancient Israel was a land accustomed to the dramatic. Its people had witnessed plagues fall upon their enemies. They had watched a sea pull apart like a curtain drawn back by invisible hands. They had eaten bread that appeared each morning on the desert ground and did not understand where it came from. They had seen fire descend on altars drenched in water and consume not just the wood and the animal laid upon it, but the very stones beneath. This was a people whose entire national identity was built on the premise that the God they served was capable of intervening in history in ways that shattered every expectation. But by the time the events of this story unfold, something had shifted. The northern kingdom of Israel had splintered away from its southern counterpart generations earlier, and the long, slow erosion of faithfulness had begun. Kings rose and fell, most of them leading their people further from the practices and the consciousness that had once made the nation extraordinary. The prophets still moved through the land, teachers, reformers, voices crying in the ordinary streets of ordinary towns, but their presence was increasingly unwelcome in the courts of power. They were tolerated on the margins, consulted occasionally in desperation, and mostly ignored by those who had decided that older, more accommodating gods suited their political ambitions better. Into this landscape walked Elisha, the son of Shaphat, the successor of the great prophet Elijah. He was not the kind of man who drew attention through dramatic self-presentation. He wore no crown. He commanded no army. He had no political alliance that made him useful to anyone in the rooms where decisions were made. What he had was a presence, a quality of consciousness that those with eyes to see recognized immediately, not because he announced it, but because it was simply there. The way warmth is present in a room before you can name the source. He traveled. This was what prophets did. They moved through the land, teaching in the towns, offering counsel where it was wanted, carrying with them whatever it was that set them apart from ordinary men. And it was on one of these travels that his road took him through a town called Shunem, a small place in the territory of Issachar, sitting in the fertile valley of Jezreel, where the grain grew well and the land had always been generous to those who worked it. And in Shunem there lived a woman. She is never named in the text. Not once across the entire account of what happens to her does anyone refer to her by name. She is identified only by where she lives and by what she does, which is perhaps more significant than any name could have been. She is identified by her actions, and her actions tell us everything we need to know. The text calls her a great woman, and this word in the Hebrew carries layers of meaning that a simple translation cannot fully capture. It suggests wealth, certainly. The narrative makes clear that her household is prosperous, that her husband is a man of means, that she has servants and resources at her disposal. But the word also carries connotations of significance, of weight, of a person whose presence in a community is felt in ways that go beyond material circumstances. She was great in the sense that she occupied meaningful space in the life of those around her. She was a person who mattered, and she was perceptive. And this is perhaps the quality the narrator most wants us to understand about her, because it is the quality that sets everything in motion. On the day that Elisha passed through Shunem for the first time, she saw him, not merely noticed him, saw him. She looked at this traveling teacher and perceived something about him that others might have missed entirely. She recognized without being told, without any introduction, credential, or formal announcement, that this man was set apart in some way, that the thing she sensed in his presence was not ordinary. She called him a holy man of God, and this was her own private assessment, formed in the moment of encounter, requiring no external confirmation. This is a remarkable detail. Faith traditions throughout history have produced countless accounts of dramatic supernatural encounters, visions, voices, and visitations that arrive with unmistakable force and leave no room for uncertainty. But the Shunammite woman's recognition of Elisha required none of that. It was quiet, interior, perceptive. She read the room, so to speak, and understood something about the man that his outer circumstances did not obviously reveal. This is the first indication of who she is, a person of unusual spiritual sensitivity, capable of seeing beneath the surface of things to whatever is actually present beneath them. And having seen, she acted. Section 2. Hospitality without expectation. The ancient world understood hospitality as a sacred obligation. In cultures where travel was dangerous, where the roads between towns offered little shelter, and where strangers were entirely dependent on the goodwill of those they encountered, the practice of welcoming guests was not simply a social courtesy, it was a moral and religious duty. To feed a traveler, to offer rest, to provide shelter for even one night was considered an act of profound significance, carrying with it a weight of meaning that modern sensibilities, surrounded by hotels, restaurants, and transportation networks, can barely reconstruct. The woman of Shunem understood this, but what she did went beyond the minimum that cultural expectation would have required. The text says that she urged him, that word suggesting not a casual offer, but an insistence, a pressing, a genuine desire to provide, rather than merely to fulfill an obligation. Elisha was passing through her town, and she stopped him. She brought him into her home, she fed him, and from that first encounter forward, whenever his travels brought him through Shunem, he stopped there to eat. A rhythm was established, a pattern, something that might have been easy to overlook in the accounting of dramatic events was quietly developing in this ordinary town between this unnamed woman and this traveling prophet. A relationship built on consistent, unrequested generosity. But she wanted to do more. At some point, she went to her husband with a proposal. This detail matters. She did not act alone. She spoke to her husband, presented her reasoning, sought his agreement. The text gives us her words, and they are striking in their practical clarity. She told him that she had perceived, that word of spiritual seeing again, that this man who passed by them regularly was holy, a man of God, and therefore, she proposed that they should build him a room, not just offer him a meal when he happened to be passing, but a permanent place, a physical structure dedicated to his use whenever his journeys brought him through Shunem. The room she proposed was small but complete, a bed so he could sleep in comfort, a table so he could work or eat, a lamp so he could read or write in the evening hours, a chair so he could sit without standing. These four things, bed, table, lamp, chair, are enumerated in the text with a specificity that feels almost domestic in its attention to detail. This woman was not thinking in grand gestures. She was thinking about what a man would actually need. What would make his rest genuine rest? What would make his study productive? What would make his time in their home something more than merely adequate? She thought about this carefully. She planned it. She convinced her husband, and then they built it. There is something important to notice here, and it is this. At no point in the planning, the building, or the welcoming of Alicia into this specially prepared room does the woman make any mention of what she hopes to receive in return. She does not hint at a need she has. She does not frame her generosity as an investment in future blessing. She does not approach the preparation of the room with any agenda beyond the straightforward desire to serve someone she recognizes as being connected to something larger than the ordinary. This is hospitality in its purest form. Service given freely, without calculation, without the quiet ledger keeping that so often runs beneath even our most generous actions. Hey, she's not building the room so that God will notice and reward her. She's not serving the prophet so that the prophet will owe her something. She's acting out of a quality of character that has not yet encountered the need that will make her generosity's significance apparent. She's simply being who she is, doing what her perception and her values move her to do, in the quiet assumption that this is simply how one lives. The room was completed. Alicia came and rested there, and for a time this was the whole of the story. A woman who acted generously, a prophet who received with gratitude, and a small upper room in a prosperous household in Shunem that became a regular stopping point on a traveling man's road. Then Elisha asked a question. He called his servant Gehazi and told him to summon the woman. When she stood before him, he said, "You have gone to all this trouble for us. What can we do for you?" And then he asked whether she might like him to speak on her behalf to the king or to the commander of the army, whether there was some political favor or official intercession that she desired, some door in the halls of power that she wanted him to open for her. Her answer was immediate and complete. She told him that she dwelt among her own people. This simple phrase carried within it a self-sufficiency, a contentment, a sense that she had what she needed and was not reaching for anything beyond it. She was not performing modesty. She was not strategically refusing in the hope that a greater offer would follow. She meant it. She was a woman who, in the deepest sense, was at peace with what she had, and who had extended her generosity not as a purchase, but as an expression of that peace. Elisha listened, and then he turned to Gehazi and asked what could be done for her. And it was Gehazi who said the thing that Elisha's question had not reached. "She has no son," he said, "and her husband is old." The woman had not mentioned this. Not once in all the interactions described to this point had she raised the subject of what was absent from her life. Whatever she carried in private, whatever ache accompanied the recognition that she had material abundance, a kind husband, and a prosperous household, and still lacked the thing that her culture considered the most essential mark of a woman's fullness and purpose. She had kept that quietly within herself. She had not made it the center of her interactions with Elisha. She had not used her hospitality as a bargaining chip for the blessing she most needed. But Gehazi saw it, and having seen it, he told his master. Section 3. A promise unexpected. There is a kind of hope that becomes too dangerous to hold. When something has been wanted long enough and not received, when the absence of it has been accommodated and rationalized and finally painfully accepted as simply the shape of one's life. The prospect of hope arriving unexpectedly is not always experienced as joy. Sometimes it is experienced as danger, because to hope again means to be vulnerable again to the specific pain of not receiving. And that is a pain that, once survived, one does not approach carelessly. The woman of Shunem had made peace with her childlessness. This was not the peace of someone who had never wanted anything different. It was the harder peace of someone who had wanted and waited and eventually organized her interior life around an acceptance of what was. She had a husband, though he was old. She had prosperity, which she used generously. She had a community among whom she dwelt with apparent belonging. She had her faith expressed in the way she lived. She had, by the standards of any honest accounting, a life of meaning and richness. And she had learned to hold that meaning and richness without making it contingent on the things she did not have. Which is why, when Alicia called her to stand in the doorway of the room they had built for him and told her that, at this season of the following year, she would embrace a son, she pushed back. "Do not lie to your servant," she said. "This is not the response of a woman without faith. Anna, this is the response of a woman who has experienced the specific grief of hope, deferred long enough that she has learned to protect herself from false comfort." She was not telling Alicia that she doubted his power. She was telling him that she could not afford to let herself believe something that might not happen. The cost of hoping and being disappointed was one she had already paid and could not easily pay again. But notice what she did not do. She did not argue further. She did not demand a sign or a guarantee. She did not refuse the word. She simply expressed, with honest directness, the fragility that lay beneath her composed exterior. And then she went back to her life. And the next year, at the appointed time, she conceived and bore a son exactly as the word had said, exactly on the schedule the prophet had named. The fulfillment of the promise was precise, unhurried, and complete. There is a quality to this kind of fulfillment that defies adequate description. When something you had surrendered returns, when a hope you had buried out of self-protection begins to breathe again, the joy of it carries within it the memory of the grief. And this combination of past loss and present arrival makes the experience more layered, more complex, and ultimately more meaningful than a straightforward answered prayer could have been. She had waited. She had stopped waiting. She had organized her life without the things she once wanted. And now it was here, small and new and utterly real in her arms. Her son grew. This is all the text tells us about the years that followed. He grew, which is to say time passed, which is to say the miracle settled into ordinary life and became the background against which everyday moments unfolded. He was not a miracle to be observed from a distance. He was a child to be fed and held and taught, a presence that filled the rooms of the house and the interior of his mother's heart with the particular kind of weight that only something long desired and finally received can carry. She had heard the impossible and received it, and for a while that was everything. Section 4. The miracle becomes ordinary life. The philosopher Simone Weil once wrote that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. To truly attend to something, to be fully present to it without the distortions of agenda, anxiety, or habit, is to give it the most complete gift available to a conscious being. And the woman of Shunem had been attentive from the beginning. She had attended to Elisha with the careful, undemanding attention of someone who sees clearly and acts on what she sees. And now she attended to her son with the particular quality of presence that only a parent who has waited long for a child can offer. The miracle had become, as all genuine miracles eventually do, simply the texture of daily life. There is no tragedy in this. It is, in fact, the natural completion of what miracles are for, not to remain extraordinary indefinitely, suspended in a state of perpetual astonishment, but to become integrated into the fabric of living, to shape the structure of ordinary days in ways that are no longer startling, but deeply real. The child born of promise and prophecy was now simply a child, with all the mundane reality that childhood involves. He ran in the fields. He watched his father's workers. He breathed the morning air of the Jezreel Valley and knew nothing of the negotiations that had surrounded his arrival except through whatever his mother, in her wisdom, chose to tell him. Years passed in the household at Shunem. The upper room still stood. Elisha still came when his travels brought him through. The relationship between the prophet and the woman who had prepared a place for him continued in the quiet rhythm that hospitality had established. And beneath it all, the consciousness that had animated her original generosity, the attentiveness, the perception, the capacity to see what was present and respond to it without calculation, remained the dominant quality of her character. She did not know what was coming. None of them did. The fields were warm in the season of harvest. The workers moved through the grain with the efficient precision of people who have done this work many times before, their bodies carrying the knowledge that seasons of labor had written into muscle and movement. The child was there among his father and the reapers, present in the way that children are present in working fields, alert, curious, moving between the adults with the easy freedom of someone who belongs to the landscape. And then something happened. The child reached up toward his father and said, "My head, my head." Two words repeated, pain that does not have more language than its own announcement, a child's body registering something wrong with the only vocabulary available to it, the name of the place where the wrong was happening. His father said to his servant, "Carry him to his mother. This is a detail worth holding." The father's response was not alarm, not panic, not the immediate recognition that something catastrophic was occurring. He sent the child to his mother, which suggests that whatever the father understood in that moment, it was not yet translated as emergency. It was something that could be addressed by bringing the child indoors, by maternal care, by the remedies that a household applied to the ordinary sufferings of children. The servant carried him to his mother. She took him and held him on her knees, and he sat there through the morning hours, the pain behind his eyes or inside his skull, unrelenting. And sometime around midday, the child died in her arms, in the house built on the miracle of his own arrival, in the arms of the woman who had been told by a prophet at the doorway of a room she had built as an act of pure generosity that she would embrace a son. Section 5. Sudden Tragedy. Grief that arrives without preparation is a particular kind of violence. There are losses that come with warning, allowing the slow withdrawal of the future, the gradual reordering of expectation that makes the final arrival of absence more bearable, if never truly bearable. And then there are losses that arrive mid-sentence, mid-morning, in the middle of an ordinary day, leaving no interval between the living world and the world after it. The child died on his mother's knees on a harvest morning in Shunem, and there was no preparation for it, no gradual understanding, no warning that would have made any difference even had it come. She held him. What happens in the interior of a human being in the first moments after an irreversible loss? In the seconds and minutes immediately after the body against you has stopped responding, after the breath that was there is not there, after the warmth begins its terrible, slow withdrawal. This is something that language has always struggled to contain. Every tradition that has tried to describe it has reached eventually for silence, because the experience is not primarily cognitive. It does not consist of thoughts. It consists of the body's refusal to accept what the body itself is already registering as true. The woman of Shunem held her son, and then she did something extraordinary. She laid him on the bed of Elisha. Think carefully about this action, because it is not obvious. It is not what grief typically produces. A grief typically produces crying out or collapse, or the desperate search for someone to tell, for the comfort of shared horror, for the relief of not being alone with the unbearable. What this woman did instead was carry the body of her dead child upstairs and place it on the bed that she and her husband had built for a prophet, and then close the door. She closed the door. She left the child in that room, in the place most associated in her household with the presence of the one who had spoken the impossible word that began all of this. and she went downstairs and did the next thing. She told her husband to send her one of the servants and one of the donkeys so that she could go to the man of God. Quickly, she said, and return. Her husband asked why she was going. It was not a feast day, and not a Sabbath, the occasions when such visits were customary, and she answered with three words that are among the most remarkable words in the entire text. It is well. Three words in Hebrew, fewer even than that, an expression meaning peace, wholeness, things being as they should be. She spoke the word of peace into a moment that contained no peace. She answered her husband's question with a declaration that was not a description of the moment's reality, but an affirmation of something she had decided to believe before the evidence appeared. This is not denial. This is not the hollow cheerfulness of someone too frightened to face what has happened. She knew what had happened. She was the one who had held him as he died. She knew the weight of the child laid on Elisha's bed. She knew exactly how nothing was well in any ordinary sense of the word. What she meant, what her "it is well" communicated, was something closer to, I have not yet said the last word about this. I have a place to go and a person to reach, and I have not yet done either of those things. Until I have done them, I am not willing to call this finished. She saddled the donkey and told her servant to drive fast and not to slow down unless she told him to. And she rode toward Mount Carmel, toward wherever Elisha was, with an urgency that the servant could feel in the pace she demanded and the silence she maintained. She was going to the source of the word that had given her the child, and she was going with the child's death carried in her chest like an accusation and a plea simultaneously. The grief of the thing taken and the demand of the thing promised held together in a faith that refused to separate them. Section 6. Radical Faith Under Pressure. The distance from Shunem to Mount Carmel was not inconsiderable. Mount Carmel rises from the coastal plain in the northwest of the land, a ridge of limestone and limestone forest that the ancient Israelites had long associated with the presence of the divine. Elijah had stood there before 450 prophets of Baal and called down fire on a drenched altar. The mountain had a reputation as a place of encounter, a high place in both the geographical and the spiritual sense, somewhere that the distance between the ordinary world and whatever lay beyond it was felt to be thinner than usual. It was toward this place that the woman of Shunem directed her servant and her donkey, and she drove them at a pace that communicated everything about her state of mind. While her words communicated almost nothing, she had said, "It is well." She was not repeating it, she was riding. Elisha saw her coming from a distance. This detail is significant. It means he was watching, which means that somewhere in his consciousness, the man of God was already attuned to the approach of something that required his attention. He told Gehazi to run and meet her and ask whether she was well, and whether her husband was well, whether the child was well. And she told Gehazi, "It is well." She said it again, the same three words she had said to her husband. But notice that she said them to Gehazi and kept moving. She did not slow down for Gehazi. She did not stop to explain herself. She passed through Gehazi's question the way someone in genuine crisis passes through well-meaning but insufficient responses, acknowledging the presence of the question, refusing to be derailed by it, continuing toward the only destination that mattered. She reached Elisha, and when she did, she fell at his feet. This physical gesture is the first indication in the text that the composure she had maintained, "It is well," the steady riding, and the refusal to explain herself to anyone not in a position to do anything, was a discipline being held over something that was anything but composed. She fell at his feet, the posture of someone who has arrived at the only place that might contain an answer and who was no longer able to maintain the uprightness that the journey required. Gehazi moved to push her away, as servants do when they perceive someone threatening the propriety of an encounter. Elisha stopped him. He said, "Let her alone, for her soul is in bitter distress within her, and the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me." This is a moment of unusual honesty in a prophetic narrative. Elisha acknowledged that he did not know. Whatever spiritual perception he possessed, it had not informed him of what this woman was carrying. He was operating in this moment without advanced knowledge, responding to her arrival and her posture rather than to information received in a prophetic way. And her first words to him were the honest, unadorned statement of her grief. "Did I ask for a son? Did I not say, 'Do not deceive me'?" This is lament. This is the ancient form of grief prayer that runs throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. The prayer that does not perform contentment, does not feign it, does not dress its pain in the language of acceptance before the acceptance has been earned. It goes directly to the source of its suffering with the rawness of authentic feeling. She was not telling Elisha that she had lost faith. She was telling him that the gift she had not asked for had been given and then removed, and that this sequence of events felt like a particular kind of cruelty, something she had not protected herself against because she had not been warned that protection might be needed. She had said, "Do not deceive me," when the promise was first made. She was saying it again now, in a different key, not as skepticism about what was possible, but as grief about what had happened. And having said it, she waited. Section 7. The Urgent Journey and What It Reveals. Before we follow Elisha back towards Shunem, it is worth pausing on the journey that brought this woman to his feet. She had held a dead child in her arms. She had carried him upstairs and laid him in a prophet's room and closed the door, an act that contained within it a kind of hope so fragile and so fierce simultaneously that it barely had a name. She had told her husband, "Everything is well." She had told Gehazi, "Everything is well." She had maintained for the entire duration of the ride from Shunem to Mount Carmel a surface of composure that revealed nothing of what she was carrying. This is not a simple thing to do. Human beings under the weight of acute grief tend toward one of two responses: collapse inward or cry outward. The collapse inward is withdrawal into a private devastation so total that external reality barely registers. The cry outward is the need to speak the thing, to share it, to distribute the unbearable weight across more than one person's consciousness. Both are natural, both are understandable, both are, in their different ways, attempts to make grief more survivable by changing its shape. The woman of Shunem did neither. She held the grief in silence, and she rode. She maintained composure not because she was disconnected from what had happened. She was entirely connected to it, as the collapse at Elisha's feet would make clear, but because she had made a decision in the first moments after the child died about what to do with the grief, rather than simply how to feel it. She had decided to move, to act, to carry the weight of the thing without putting it down until she had reached the one person who might know what to do with it. This quality, the capacity to hold pain without collapsing under it long enough to act effectively, is one of the subtler forms of courage available to human beings. It does not announce itself. It does not look heroic from the outside. From the outside, it looks like someone riding a donkey urgently across a stretch of landscape while telling people that everything is fine. But inside, it is the disciplined, costly, wholly deliberate act of refusing to let grief make all the decisions before faith has had its say. She had built a room for a prophet. She had served him without asking for anything. She had received an impossible gift. She had loved that gift for however many years the text compresses into the phrase "the child grew." And now the gift was gone, and she was riding, and she was not yet willing to call it gone. There is a specific species of faith described in this journey that theologians across centuries of commentary have struggled to adequately name. It is not the faith of certainty. She did not know that Alicia could do anything. It is not the faith of calm acceptance. She was in anguish, as her behavior at his feet made clear. It is not the faith of the simple or the naive. She was a woman of considerable intelligence and spiritual perception who understood exactly what death meant. It is the faith of persistence, the faith that says, I do not know what comes next, but I know the direction I should move, and I am moving in it, and I will not stop until I have exhausted the possibilities that remain available to me. It is the faith that rides through uncertainty without having resolved the uncertainty. It is the faith that holds together in the same chest the full weight of the grief and the full weight of the hope without allowing either to cancel the other out. She reached Mount Carmel because she kept riding. She reached Elisha because she refused to stop for Gehazi, and having reached him, she spoke her grief out loud, which was the only honest thing remaining to be done. See Section 8, Confrontation with the Prophet. Elisha's response to her grief was immediate and practical. He called Gehazi and told him, Gird your loins and take my staff in your hand and go. If you meet anyone, do not greet him. If anyone greets you, do not reply to him. And when you reach the house, lay the staff on the face of the boy. There is something important in these instructions that can be easily passed over. The staff was an object of the prophet's presence, a physical extension of his identity, something he had carried and touched, something that, in the symbolic vocabulary of the ancient world, represented authority and connection. To send the staff ahead was to send something of himself ahead, which is to say that Elisha was attempting to act at a distance, so to project the effect of his presence into a situation he had not yet reached in person. The instruction to Gehazi not to greet anyone and not to respond to greetings was also significant. In the ancient Near East, greetings were not casual exchanges. They were ritual transactions, formal acknowledgments of relationship and status that carried their own weight and required their own attention. To stop and greet was to enter into a social obligation that would delay the journey and divide the focus. Elisha was telling Gehazi, move with absolute urgency and absolute attention, without any of the social friction that ordinary travel accumulates. The speed and the singular focus of the journey are not merely practical, they are part of the act itself. But then the woman said something that revealed the limits of this approach. She said, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, I will not leave you. This is not polite conversation. This is the declaration of someone who knows that the proxy solution being offered is insufficient and who refuses to accept it. She had written to Elisha, not to his staff. She had sought the man, not the instrument. She understood, with the same clear-eyed perception that had recognized him as a man of God from the first moment she saw him, that whatever was needed in the room in Shunem required Elisha himself, not a representative object or a representative servant. She would not leave him. She meant it, and Elisha got up and went with her. This moment, the prophet rising from wherever he was sitting on Mount Carmel and following this woman back down toward Shunem, is, in its own understated way, one of the most powerful moments in the account. She had been given a proxy, and she had refused it. Not rudely, not with theological argument, not with a lecture on the insufficiency of the proposed solution. Simply with a statement that she would not go without him, and the evident intention to stand there until her statement was honored. And it was honored, because she was right, because her perception, which had been accurate from the beginning, from the first moment she looked at Elisha passing through Shunem, and recognized something in him that most people would have missed, was accurate again. Now the staff was not sufficient, the servant was not sufficient. The thing that was needed could only be brought by the one who had spoken the word that had begun this whole movement of events. They walked back toward Shunem, and the distance that she had covered at urgent full gallop on the way out would now be covered at the pace of walking feet. Ahead of them, Gehazi was already running with the staff. Section 9. The Failed Attempt. Gehazi ran ahead and laid the staff on the face of the boy, and there was no sound, no response, no breath returned, no warmth appeared beneath the cold surface of the child's skin. No sneezing, no stirring, no indication of any kind that the staff's presence in the room had changed anything at all. He returned to meet Elisha and told him, "The boy has not awakened." This is one of the most quietly devastating sentences in the entire account, and it raises a question that the text does not answer directly. Why did it not work? Various traditions of commentary have offered various answers. Some have suggested that Gehazi's character, he would later be revealed as someone capable of significant moral failing, made him an insufficient vessel for the transmission of whatever was needed. Some have argued that the attempt with the staff was never really intended to succeed, that it was a first step designed to demonstrate that the solution was not mechanical, that it would not be accomplished by the application of a ritual object, even a holy one. Some have read in the failure a lesson about the insufficiency of proxy faith, the impossibility of delegating the encounter between the divine and the desperate to someone who is not themselves the one who is desperate. What the text does make clear is that the failure did not deter Elisha, and the woman who had refused to leave him had apparently always understood that the staff would not be enough. She had insisted on bringing the man himself for a reason, and now the man himself arrived. He went in and shut the door just as she had shut the door when she laid the child on the bed. The closing of the door in both cases is significant. It marks the creation of a private space, a threshold between the ordinary world outside and whatever is about to happen inside. She had closed the door on her grief, containing it within the room most associated with a prophetic presence until she could bring that presence to confront it. He closed the door on whatever was about to happen, making it an encounter between himself, the child, and whatever he understood to be the source of his authority. A private, unwitnessed, an undramatized engagement with the most intimate of questions. No one was watching. No audience was assembled. No performance was required. Section 10. The Prayer of Desperation. Elisha prayed to the Lord. This is the only action the text describes in these first moments inside the room. And it is worth sitting with the simplicity of it. He prayed. He did not recite a formula. He did not pronounce a word of authority. He did not perform a ritual sequence. He prayed, which is the most primary of all the postures available to someone who understands that what is needed goes beyond the reach of what they themselves can accomplish. And then he did something unusual. He lay down on the child, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands. He stretched himself out over the small cold body of the boy, the living over the dead, the warm over the cold, the breathing over the unbreathing, and the child's body grew warm. This act has been interpreted in many different ways across the history of commentary. Some have seen in it a practical dimension, the attempt to transfer warmth, to restore circulation, something resembling what a much later era would call resuscitation. Some have seen in it a purely symbolic act, the living prophet placing himself in intimate contact with death as a way of asserting the proximity of life to whatever death had taken. Some have seen in it the most literal possible expression of the theology that runs throughout the Hebrew prophetic tradition. The idea that the divine presence moves through embodied, incarnate action, through the physical contact of one creature reaching toward another across the boundary that seemed final. Whatever its meaning, the act was followed by signs. Alicia got up and walked back and forth in the room, pacing, a detail that carries in it something very human, the restlessness of waiting without knowing when or whether. And then he stretched himself over the child again, and the child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. 7 sneezes. An odd, specific, irreducibly physical detail in the middle of what would otherwise be a purely spiritual account. 7. In the symbolic vocabulary of the Hebrew tradition, it is the number of completion, the week completed, the creation completed, the thing having arrived at its intended fullness. But here it is not an abstract symbol. It is a child sneezing, a body re-engaging with the process of breathing, a respiratory system announcing its return to function in the most ordinary of biological ways. The miracle was announced by sneezing, not by trumpet, not by thunder, not by the dramatic vocabulary that dramatic moments are usually expected to employ. By the sound of a child's body doing what children's bodies do. Only this child's body had moments before been doing none of the things bodies do. And now it was 7 times. And then he opened his eyes. Section 11. Restoration. Alicia called Gehazi and told him to call the Shunammite woman. She came and he said, "Take up your son." She came in and she fell at his feet and she bowed herself to the ground and she took up her son and went out. That is the entire description. That is all the text gives us. No speech, no tearful outpouring of gratitude, no long prayer of thanksgiving, no recitation of what had happened and what it meant, no public declaration of what she had learned. She came in, she fell, she bowed, she took her son, she went out. The bowing to the ground is the gesture of someone encountering something that exceeds the vocabulary of ordinary response. It is the posture the body assumes when words are not sufficient, when the magnitude of what has occurred makes everything that language could offer feel inadequate to the moment. She did not speak because there was nothing to say that the gesture did not already say more completely. She took her son. This simple, declarative, concrete phrase is the completion of an arc that began long before the child was born, long before the promise was spoken, long before the room was built and the meal was shared and the perception was formed. It began in the quality of character that saw clearly and acted generously without requiring anything in return. It was prepared in the years of faithful, ordinary living that preceded any miracle. It was tested in the grief that no one who had not paid close attention would have known she was carrying. And it was completed in the quiet, private moment of a woman walking out of a room with a living child she had laid in it as a dead one. Miracle completes what faith began, not the other way around. The faith came first. The building came first. The seeing and the serving and the writing and the refusing to accept the proxy came first. And the miracle arrived into a space that faith had already prepared for it. See Section 12. The spiritual architecture of this story. Every significant narrative contains within it not just the events that it describes, but the shape of the understanding that those events are meant to convey. The story of the woman of Shunem has been told and retold across millennia because it carries within it a particular architecture of spiritual understanding that speaks to something persistent in human experience, something that does not belong only to ancient Israel or to any specific religious tradition, but that touches the universal questions of loss, hope, grief, and the relationship between human action and divine response. The first element of this architecture is the principle that preparation precedes miracle. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive aspect of the story. And we are accustomed to thinking of miracles as responses, as divine answers to human need that arrive in the moment of desperation, when the need is most acute and the human resources most clearly exhausted. And miracles of that kind certainly exist within the tradition, but the miracle in this story does not arrive in the moment of greatest desperation. The miracle arrives into a life that had already been prepared for it. By years of quiet generosity, by the building of a room that was not asked for, by the service of a man of God before any blessing was received from him or even anticipated. The child was not given because his mother fell at Elisha's feet in need. The child was given because his mother had built a room, and the room was built because she had seen clearly. And the seeing clearly was an expression of who she already was before any of this began. This sequence matters enormously. It suggests that the preparation for the miraculous does not begin in the crisis that eventually makes the miracle necessary. It begins long before, in the ordinary decisions of ordinary days, in the quality of attention brought to an encounter, in the generosity extended without calculation, in the service given without the expectation of return. The crisis reveals what the preparation has made possible, but the preparation had to come first. The second element of this architecture is the principle that authentic faith includes lament. The woman of Shunem did not perform composure before Elisha. She fell at his feet, she spoke her grief out loud, and she said, Did I ask for a son? This is not the language of someone who has elevated themselves above their pain into a spiritual detachment that no longer feels the full weight of loss. This is the language of someone who feels exactly how much this hurts and who brings that hurt directly to the encounter with the divine rather than processing it privately first and presenting only the sanitized remainder. The Hebrew tradition that produced this story is full of this kind of lament. The Psalms are full of it. Job is full of it. The great figures of the tradition speak their grief without polishing it first because the tradition understands that honest grief offered to God is a form of trust. The trust that the relationship can hold the honest feeling, that what is real will not be rejected because it is not beautiful. She lamented honestly, and she was heard. The third element of this architecture is the principle that faith persists through the silence. Between the moment the child was conceived and the moment the child died, there is a period of the text that is compressed into a handful of sentences. The years of the child's growth would have been the years in which the promise was being fulfilled in the most ordinary ways possible. The toddler learning to walk, the small child learning to speak, the boy beginning to venture further from the house. All of this is rendered in almost no words at all. This is not carelessness on the part of the narrative. It is an observation about the nature of the miraculous in daily life. The extraordinary becomes ordinary. The answered prayer becomes the background of living. The thing once desperately wanted becomes simply the thing that is present, and its presence is no less real for being less astonishing than it once was. And in the silence of those years, the silence between the miracle and the crisis, the woman was simply living faithfully, generously, present to the ordinary texture of a life that had been given back to her in a form she had not expected. She was not, as far as the text indicates, doing anything particularly dramatic. She was being who she was, and being who she was, it turns out, was exactly what was needed when the crisis arrived. The fourth element of this architecture is the principle that persistence and prayer matter. Elisha prayed. He prayed, and then he acted in a physical way, and then he paced, and then he stretched himself out over the child again, and then the child sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. This sequence, the prayer, the action, the waiting, the continued action, is not described in the text as a lack of faith. It is not described as evidence that the first attempt failed because something was wrong with the approach. It is described simply as what happened, which suggests that the process itself, the sustained, repeated engagement with the situation, was part of the miracle rather than a sign of its absence. This is important for anyone who has ever prayed once and not received what they prayed for. The text does not suggest that a single prayer is the complete expression of the practice, that a single attempt exhausts the possibilities, or that persistence beyond the first try indicates insufficient faith. Alicia prayed, lay over the child, got up, walked, returned, and lay over the child again. The miracle arrived through the sustained, embodied, repeated engagement, not through a single perfectly executed moment of spiritual performance. And the fifth element, which underlies all the others, is this. The God in this story is a God who restores what seemed permanently lost. The child was dead, not metaphorically dead, not diminished, ill, or imperiled. Dead, laid on a bed with the door closed, cold beneath the warm hands that stretched out over him. There was no medical qualification, no diagnostic uncertainty, no possibility left open in the text that what the mother had held in her arms through the morning hours was anything other than the final state of a child who had lived and now did not. And then he sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. What this story carries at its deepest level is the assertion that the category of permanently lost is not as final as it appears from within the experience of loss. Not because loss is not real, the woman's grief was entirely real, and the text does not minimize it, but because the story being told is one in which the ending has not yet been written when the middle is darkest. The room closed, the door shut, the child cold, the mother riding across the landscape with grief in her chest and hope in her direction. These are not the final images the story offers. They are the middle. They are the darkness before the 7 sneezes and the open eyes and the words, "Take up your son." This is not a promise that every grief resolves in this life. The tradition is too honest to make that claim, and the history of human experience is too full of losses that are not reversed in any visible way. But it is the assertion that reversal is possible, that what seems final sometimes is not, and that the appropriate response to that possibility is to ride toward it with urgency, refusing to slow down for anyone who cannot help. Section 13. The legacy of an unnamed woman. She does not appear again in the text after she walks out of the room with her living son. The story continues in the book of 2 Kings. There are other accounts, other encounters, other events that follow this one chronologically, but she herself does not reappear until a brief mention much later in the narrative. In a context that tells us the family eventually left the land during a famine and returned after 7 years, at which point the king was miraculously predisposed to restore their property because Gehazi happened to be telling him about her at the exact moment she arrived to make her case. Even in this later appearance, she's identified only as the woman whose son Elisha restored to life. She is still unnamed. She's still defined by her actions and their consequences rather than by her given name. This anonymity is in a way the most appropriate possible condition for the story she inhabits. Names individuate, specify, locate a person in a particular time, in social context in ways that can make them feel distant from readers in other times and other contexts. But the unnamed woman of Shunem is universally available. She can be anyone, can be recognized by anyone who has ever prepared for something without knowing what the preparation was for, who has ever served without calculating the return, who has ever ridden through their grief toward the only help that might remain available, refusing to slow down, refusing to accept the proxy, insisting on the real thing. She belongs to the tradition not as a specific historical individual trapped in the Second Kings of ancient Israel, but as an archetype, a figure through whom certain qualities of faith and character are demonstrated in a way that remains recognizable and applicable across any distance of time. The qualities themselves are worth naming clearly because they are not the dramatic qualities that tend to receive the most attention in the teaching of faith traditions. She was not a martyr. She was not an ascetic. She was not particularly dramatic in her piety. She did not perform her faith in ways that made it visible and admirable from the outside. She simply built a room. She simply told the truth about her grief. She simply kept writing. She simply refused to accept less than what she had come for. These are the qualities that prepared the miracle. Attentiveness, generosity without calculation, honest lament, persistent pursuit, the refusal to settle for insufficient proxy solutions, and the willingness to receive what arrived with the whole of herself rather than only the composed, acceptable portion. Most of the people who have ever loved well, served quietly, maintained their faith in silence through seasons of waiting, and found restoration waiting on the other side of their most persistent grief. Most of them are unnamed. They do not appear in lists of the great. They do not have monuments erected in their honor. They are, in the accounting of human history, the vast majority. The ones who built the rooms without knowing what the rooms were for, who kept the lamps burning in the upper chambers, who rode urgently in the direction of help before they had any assurance that help would arrive. She is all of them. She is the one the story chose to tell, to speak for all the ones the story could not contain. Section 14. The room and what it means. Let us return one final time to the room. A bed, a table, a lamp, a chair. Four things, simple, practical, complete, the minimum necessary to make a space genuinely hospitable, to give rest, to give workspace, to give light, to give rest in a different form. The room was not elaborate. It was not a monument to the generosity that built it. It was a functional space designed with attention to actual need rather than impressive gesture. But it was permanent. That is the detail that sets it apart from the meals she had offered before, to from the passing hospitality of a traveler fed to table and sent on his way. She built a room. She created a standing space, a place that would be there whenever Elisha returned. A physical expression of her commitment to his presence in her household that did not require repeated decision or renewed invitation. The decision was made once in the building, and the room thereafter spoke for itself. This is a metaphor that extends well beyond its historical context. What are the rooms we build for the things we recognize as significant? For the practices, the people, and the orientations of consciousness that we understand to be connected to something larger than the immediate demands of daily life. How often do we offer meals, temporary, situational, easily withdrawn, when what is genuinely called for is the building of something permanent, a structural commitment rather than a case-by-case decision? The woman of Shunem built a room because she perceived something real and acted on her perception with a commitment proportionate to the significance of what she had perceived. She did not wait to be asked. She did not wait to feel an external pressure that made the building necessary. She saw something and she built something in the quiet confidence of someone whose perception could be trusted and whose character was already organized around acting on what was seen. And the room became the place where her son was laid when he died. And the room became the place where her son was raised when the miracle came. The same space, the same four objects: bed, table, lamp, chair, present in the room where the child was laid cold and still, and the door was closed. and present in the room where the child sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. The room built as an act of generosity became the theater of resurrection. The space she had prepared for the man of God became the space where God moved. There's a theological intuition here that requires no theological language to receive. The places we prepare with genuine attention and authentic generosity tend to become the places where significant things happen. Not always, not inevitably, not as a mechanical guarantee that hospitality offered produces miracles required, but there is a connection, a correlation between the quality of space prepared and the quality of what can occur within it that the story of the Shunammite makes visible in an unforgettable way. She prepared the space. The space became sacred, not because of a specific ceremony or consecration, but because of the quality of the intention that built it, the quality of the presence that inhabited it, and the quality of the faith that, in the most desperate moment imaginable, carried a dead child to that room, laid him there, and closed the door. The room was the first act of faith. Everything else followed from it. Section 15. It is well. The deepest meaning. She said it as well 3 times in the narrative. She said it to her husband when she asked for the donkey and the servant. She said it to Gehazi when he ran to meet her on the road. And tradition across centuries of reading this text has heard in that repeated phrase something that goes beyond its immediate practical function, as a deflection of questions she did not have time to answer. It is well is an act of faith spoken into the throat of catastrophe. It does not mean everything is fine. She was not describing the state of things as they appeared. It does not mean she was not in pain. She was in the deepest pain that the loss of a child can produce. It does not mean she had no uncertainty. She was riding toward a man she hoped could help with no guarantee that he could. What it means in the deepest reading of the phrase is closer to this. I have not yet said the last word. The story is not over. The ending has not been written yet, and I refuse to write it prematurely. And so, while I move toward whatever has the power to change this, I will not use the language of finality. I will not speak the closing words while there is still road ahead of me, and a direction in which I can ride. It is well is the declaration of someone who understands that their perception of the present moment is not the whole of reality, that what appears to be the end may not be the end, that the child on the bed with the door closed may not be the conclusion of the story, and that the appropriate response to that possibility is to keep moving. There is a courage in these 3 words that is not obvious until you understand what she was holding when she spoke them. She was holding the death of her child, the violation of the promise that had given him to her, the terror of approaching the prophet who had made that promise, and facing him with the evidence of its apparent failure. She was holding all of that, and she was saying, "It is well," not because it was, but because she had decided to refuse the final accounting before the final word had been spoken. This is perhaps the deepest spiritual posture the story teaches, not the joy of receiving the miracle that is easy, or at least easier to sustain, not the patience of waiting for the miracle to arrive that requires endurance, but this particular quality of courage. The deepest posture is this one, the refusal to speak the closing words when the story is still moving, the capacity to say it as well in the middle of what feels like the end. The faith that persists not in the absence of evidence, but in the explicit presence of evidence that seems to argue for the opposite conclusion. She said it is well with a dead child in the room behind her, a long road ahead of her, and no guarantee that what she was riding toward would make any difference at all. And it was. It was well, not when she said it, not yet, but because she said it and kept riding, refused the proxy, fell at the prophet's feet, spoke her grief honestly, and insisted on the man himself. Because of all of that, the word that seemed impossible became true. And when she walked out of the room with her living son in her arms, it as well was no longer an act of faith held against the evidence. It was simply the truth. Closing reflection, a night meditation for tired hearts. You are perhaps at the end of a long day. The world has asked a great deal of you, asked it without ceremony, without acknowledging that what was being requested was significant in the way that life tends to ask its most exhausting things as though they were ordinary. And you have done what you could. You've moved through the hours with whatever quality of attention and presence you had available, which was probably not the quality you would have preferred, but was the quality you had. And that is enough. That is more than enough. That is the whole of what anyone can offer. The quality of presence that is actually available, not the quality that would be available in some hypothetical, better version of the day. The woman of Shunem lived her faith in the small hours of small days. She did not live it in the dramatic hour of the miracle's arrival, though she was present for that too. She lived it in the decision to prepare a room for a traveling man she recognized as significant. She lived it in the regular meals offered without asking for return. She lived it in the honest conversation with her husband about what she perceived and what she wanted to do about it. She lived it in the grief she carried privately on the long mornings of the child's growing years. Grief that had been organized into acceptance but never entirely dissolved. She lived it in the decision, when the worst happened, to close the door, saddle the donkey, and ride. Every one of these acts was small. None of them at the time it was being performed was recognizable as faith in action. The building of the room looked like interior decorating. The regular meals looked like hospitality. The quiet, private grief looked like what it was: a woman who had wanted something and had not received it, and had made peace with that. The writing looked like a mother going to find help for a sick child. None of it looked from the outside like the architecture of a miracle. And yet the miracles we are hoping for, the reversals we need in the situations that feel most irreversible, the moments of restoration that we are not sure are coming, these tend to find their way into lives that have been prepared to receive them. Not by dramatic acts of conspicuous piety, not by the performance of faith for the sake of an audience, but by the quiet, consistent, cumulative weight of ordinary faithfulness. The room built, the meal offered, the truth told, the direction maintained, the door closed with the certain faith that something real has been placed in that room, and that the word spoken over it has not yet finished being true. You have, in the living of your life, been building rooms. Some of them you may not even recognize as rooms. Some of them you built without knowing what they were for, in the way the woman of Shunem built a room for a prophet without knowing that the room would one day receive the child the same prophet gave her. Some of them feel right now like empty spaces, spaces prepared for something that has not yet arrived, or for something that arrived and then was taken away before it could be fully received. The story of the Shunammite does not promise that every room will be filled in the way you hoped. It does not offer a mechanical guarantee that preparation produces the specific outcome you prepared for. Honest reading of any tradition requires acknowledging that some griefs are not reversed in this life, that some rooms remain empty in ways that break the heart. That faith does not always produce the sneezing 7 times and the opening of eyes that you rode across the landscape hoping for. But it does offer this: the quality of character that prepared the space matters. The generosity extended without calculation matters. The honesty of the lament matters. The refusal to accept the proxy when the real thing is what is needed matters too. The writing itself, the direction of the movement, even when the destination is uncertain, The three words spoken into the middle of what seems like the end. It is well. These things matter in ways that are not always immediately visible, but are real. And sometimes, not always, not mechanically, not as a reward that can be reliably predicted. Sometimes the child opens his eyes. Sometimes the word spoken years ago in an open doorway turns out to still be true. Sometimes the room built in an act of quiet generosity becomes the room where the most important thing happens. And sometimes in the ordinary middle of an ordinary night, having laid down whatever the day has left you carrying, the most faithful thing available is to close your own eyes in the trust that it is well, that the story is still moving, that the last word has not been spoken, that whatever is most real in your life is being held in hands larger than fear currently fills, and that the direction you are moving, even when you cannot see the destination, is the right direction. Let the room you have built hold you tonight. Let the faith that prepared the way trust the way. Let the words spoken over your life continue to be true in the dark hours where their truth is doing its deepest work. It is well. Rest now.